Good evening. السلام عليكم. أنا اسمي غنى بداوي. Good evening. My name is Guna Bdewi. I am international lawyer, a doctorate in international law, and specialized in international criminal law, international human rights, and transitional justice. I work at the University of Ottawa, a Human Rights and Education Center. So we arrived to the last session of today, which is the Transitional Justice and Rebuilding Yemen. And we all know that transitional justice, or the concept of transitional justice, is relatively new. So we can trace it back to the 19th century, after the World War II. And then we saw that first at the Nuremberg, and then with different causes like Argentina, Colombia, and others. But the process of transitional justice has evolved since then. And of course, what happened in Argentina cannot be expected in Yemen. And that's why we have our experts in here who will tell us more on how to implement transitional justice. So transitional justice, just to start with a definition before the conversation, is just a kind of, it refers to the society and how to deal with the gross violations of human rights that happen during a conflict. And transitional justice has different pillars that we are going to discuss today, which is, but not limited to, truth seeking, prosecution, reparation, and institutional reform, and other issues that falls under these pillars. In Yemen, there was an attempt for transitional justice, and there was an attempt as well for signing on the Roma Statute of International Criminal Court. But where are we now? And that's what we're planning to do today. So today we're going to ask these questions on how an effective application of transitional justice will contribute to lifting Yemeni society out of the war and violence. And this question will be answered by our first two speakers. And the last question will be, what is the role of the regional actors and international community to rebuilding Yemen and establish democracy? So I'd like to welcome our three panelists, Dr. John Packer, a professor in international conflict resolution at the Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa, and lawyer Abdurrahman Berman, an attorney and executive director of the American Center of Justice, and last but not least, Madame Bushra Nasser, a founder of SIBA Consulting Service Economy and Development Expert. She's coming here from Scotland, as I understand. Sweden. From Sweden, okay. So without due delay, I would like to invite Professor John Packer to speak. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind words and the opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, it is axiomatic that to make peace, we must make peace with our enemies, not with our friends. It's also a hard fact of life that we don't only have friends. This is true amongst our compatriots as it is amongst foreigners. Let me thank, first of all, the organizers of this conference. I commend the initiative and the persistent efforts of the organizers, and I'm grateful for the invitation to express my views as a foreigner and as a friend. Specifically, I come here owing to the fact that I was the legal advisor to the first envoy, the special advisor of the Secretary General to Yemen between 2012 and 2014. In other words, in the context of the National Dialogue Conference and the transitional process. In that euphoric moment of the now distant Arab Spring, there was great hope and evident risk in Yemen and elsewhere. But there was also deep and violent division within the country and beyond. As we were reminded this morning, without doubt, external actors interfered with and take substantial responsibility for the prevailing situation. But it is also real politics reflecting real interests which still predominate and in important ways supersede, not in law, but in fact, the Yemeni interests, resources, and engagements. In other words, there are real international concerns regarding the situation in Yemen. The understandable reaction of many Yemenis is to lament this fact, a lament that I share. Nonetheless, in 2010 and still today, the recognized UN member state of Yemen was and remains deeply divided. This is a legitimate international concern. Worse, today, in many respects, Yemen is a failed state. This is a matter of concern, above all, for Yemenis who bear the tremendous costs, but it is also an interest to external actors and to the putative international community. As one non-Yemeni ambassador once told me pointedly, the world cares about Yemen for only two reasons. First, the transit of hydrocarbons around the Gulf of Aden, and second, counterterrorism, notably its export, less so terrorism in Yemen. But this, the international community cares, beyond this, the international community cares largely about what can be taken from Yemen. Clearly, the world hardly, if at all, cares about Yemenis, about the people and their plight. Rather, the now perhaps 30 million poor souls of Yemeni citizens, their agency and their assets have been instrumentalized by external actors for foreign interests. It is not the purpose of this panel, nor my contribution now, to analyze this fact, but I submit that it is a basic context for the challenges of attaining sustainable peace and democracy in Yemen, which must be, I believe, above all, the work of Yemenis, of peace and democracy by Yemenis, of Yemenis, and for Yemenis, including with regard to Yemen's place in the world, including Yemen's state structure, including whether Yemenis decide amongst themselves to remain a single state, of which form or constitutional arrangement, and with which shared priorities. In short, I suggest it is up to Yemenis to find their own modus vivendi, their way of living together. That is your right, notwithstanding the challenges and the many who will work against you. In the autumn of 2011, then on the cusp of civil war, Yemenis decided to take in their own hands their own future, the right to, and I quote, freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, to quote Article 1 of the two covenants of the United Nations on the right of self-determination. The international community, in the explicit terms of UN Security Council, fully supported the process. Security Council Resolution 2014 of 21 October 2011 endorsed the Gulf Cooperation Council initiative and its eventual accord, a thin 1.5-page document, notably with the provision of good offices to assist Yemen through, and I quote, an inclusive and Yemeni-led political process of transition that meets the legitimate demands and aspirations of the Yemeni people for change, including to redress many grievances, but mainly to look forward in a constructive, future-oriented vision and process. This was followed promptly by specific steps. Notably, a month later, in November 2011, agreements were adopted by the Gulf Cooperation Council, resulting in the end of the 32-year dictatorship of Ali Abdullah Saleh, which was predicated on his, and I quote, absolute immunity, and the start of a 27-month transition process, a political process set out in the UN-brokered 20-page implementation agreement, which foresaw 2 stages, including a legitimate, if extra-constitutional, interim presidency, a reformed security sector, a comprehensive national dialogue conference for a new Yemen, as it was called, to be followed by a new constitution, a referendum, and elections on which basis a genuinely democratic Yemen would in fact self-determine its politics and development. I'm glad that Tawakkol Karman this morning and others referenced the NDC outcomes and the draft constitution. Yet that process took longer than foreseen, hampered by the failure of other elements of the transition to take place, notably the security sector reform. Of course, the two were and remain interrelated and interdependent. This is without saying anything about foreign interferences. In the political transition aimed to move from autocracy to democracy, the idea was to move from abusive, centralized, clientelist dictatorship to popular sovereignty, respecting the genuine will of the people and serving the real and substantive needs and interests of the Yemeni people in their rich diversity and accommodating their real and legitimate differences in needs, interests, and aspirations. The political transition was expressly to move from benefits for a few to benefits for all, from poor and corrupt governance to good and responsible governance. This implies complex systems and effective institutions. Justice is an important part of the vision and system, but justice is only one part of a sustainable peace and a prosperous society. Especially in contexts of significant complexity, such as in Yemen, simplifications and reductionist slogans must be discarded. Above all, the perfect must not be the enemy of the good, of effective arrangements, of progress that is good enough as a basis on which to take progressive steps and construct and sustain peace and development. So I finally come to the relationship between peace and justice. It has been observed that war is the negation of human rights, and it has been said that justice is problematical in the creation of prosperity amidst widespread violence. In other words, it's difficult to obtain. It is also a matter of inescapable logic that it is not possible to achieve what Johan Galtung calls positive peace, meaning self-managed, resilient societies that peacefully deal with usual conflicts of interest within society, before achieving the minimum of what Galtung calls negative peace, i.e. stopping widespread violence or war. To use another famous terminology, it first of all is required to move from war to jaw. This implies a basic accord and confidence in which parties may agree and issues can be contemplated. This is a conundrum. It's part of a chicken or egg problem. There is no fully satisfying a priori recipe, but it seems clear that justice in its broad and full sense is not likely or even possible in the midst of war, and certainly the absence of a basic rule of law, including respect for fundamental human rights of life, security of person, and fundamental freedoms. I submit this is a shared interest of all Yemenis because the costs of war are so great that the prospect of ongoing war is only destructive and holds no hope whatsoever. Only warmongers prosper. So, even negative peace requires a minimum of accord. It requires a mutual acknowledgement of parties that some foundational understanding is at hand. It is not to like or agree with the other parties about positions or aspirations, including difficult issues such as local administration or even issues of secession. Again, jaw is better than war. This is absolutely necessary amongst compatriots. Yemeni society has abundant historical and cultural credentials to pursue this. It must now draw on those to achieve amongst themselves, amongst yourself, the space and terms to take the first steps. Failure to do so only frustrates actors and will fuel war, eventually, as has already been seen, for people to take their own measures in hand. So to justice. Every society requires the submission or conformity of the people to some basic norms in order for people to plan and conduct their relations, to decide about their own lives, to invest and pursue in their own or collective needs and interests. Some basic security and foreseeability in life is essential. This implies some fairness, in particular for a democracy which presumes equal citizens, equally protected and equally free. Indeed, for this reason, the first public town hall of the National Dialogue Conference in 2012 was on the idea of active citizenship, an event broadcast on Yemeni television and radio and watched abroad, and I dare say not welcomed by some neighboring states. Justice in this sense is essentially about fairness. This is not complex, but it is fundamental. In the absence of any fairness, there can be no confidence and there is unlikely to be peace. There are four kinds of justice. Distributive, meaning determining who gets what. Procedural, determining how fairly people are treated. Retributive, based on punishment for wrongdoing. And restorative, which tries to restore relationships or rightness or decency and reliability. Yemen has challenges on each of these forms of justice. One does not, in principle, supersede or precede the others. It is for Yemenis to decide and to set their own priorities and negotiate these, including decisions about the order and the terms of particular solutions. But in the National Dialogue Conference, many of these were expressed and addressed in terms of lists of grievances. Some of these had broader reach and larger support. Key were demands, mainly from Southerners, for restoration of property taken after 1994, for jobs and pensions taken away. Accordingly, 2 independent commissions were established to address these while the national dialogue continued. Over 100,000 claimants responded under each of these commissions. And the Emir of Qatar was persuaded to provide an initial $150 million to help. Some issues require acknowledgement, some require truth-telling and apology, some issues require accountability. Clearly, different issues require different measures, take more or less time, require more or less investment, imply the existence of reliable institutions, such as judiciaries, and available means of repair, such as payment for compensation. Very, very few of these exist in the context of war, or even the initial stages of building negative peace. Some may be best addressed in time or in sequence and possibility of external assistance. I'm almost done. In this regard, let me just underline that it is vital for this notion of justice to draw upon the experiences of other successful political transitions. And I draw your attention, we can discuss them, South Africa, Spain, you mentioned Argentina, and others. Let me just conclude by saying that I suggest that Yemenis should take note of these experiences and shape their own sensible solutions. Yemenis have largely already done so. In the National Dialogue Conference, one of the 9 fundamental subjects was the issues of national dimension, national reconciliation, transitional justice. And amongst the most detailed of the reports and the section of the outcome document addresses all of these. In my opinion, they remain largely valid and offer reasonable starting point to recommence and determine a peace process that will be sustainable and render the outcomes that are sought. Allow me one coda to my remarks, returning to the idea of it's important to make peace even with your enemies, especially compatriots. In the course of the National Dialogue Conference, notably after Ansar Allah and representatives of Southern Iraq, fellow Yemeni citizens, were persuaded to enter the negotiations of the process and to participate peacefully, of the 565 delegates, only 3 were assassinated. All 3 were Ansar Allah representatives, 10% of their constituency, including Yemen's foremost constitutional scholar, Professor Sharif al-Din, who many will remember. In my opinion, he was a patriotic Yemeni. He was a great asset for your country, and he was a Democrat. I believe he was murdered by Yemeni opponents who were against the success of the National Dialogue Conference. Nonetheless, Ansar Allah continued their participation in the National Dialogue and afterwards. When later the federal arrangement for administrative units was unilaterally drawn by President Hadi, clearly contrary to the position and interests of Ansar Allah and contrary to agreed consensus, and without serious examination of recommendations provided to President Hadi by a number of actors, Ansar Allah decided to withdraw in a breach of in the loss of its confidence. And so the slippery slope of war was set in motion and steps were taken backward. This coincided with geopolitical developments which we can also take into account. I just want to underline, the Yemenis must now reassert themselves for their self-determination and take back in their hands, your country and your future, and you must make peace with your enemies at home and abroad. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So next is Council Abdurrahman Berman, please.
السلام عليكم وسعد الله مساءكم جميعا. أعتقد أن جاءت فقرتنا الأخيرة وربما يكون الجميع قد في حالة من الإنهاك والتعب، لكن سنحاول أن نختصر الوقت. أنا أبتدأ ورقتي هي عنوانها حول العدالة الانتقالية بين إيجاد النموذج وتحديات النجاح. أفتتح هذه الورقة بكلمة للزعيم العالمي نيلسون مانديلا الذي قال فيها: في سياق تعافي البلدان من الصدمات الماضية وجروحها عليها ابتكار آليات ليسلم على جهة الانتهاكات السابقة لحقوق الإنسان، بل لضمان استعادة كرامة الضحايا والناجين وأقاربهم. الحرب في اليمن أو الحرب الأهلية خلفت واقع سلبيا مليئا بالندوب العميقة على مستويات متعددة طالت جميع جوانب الحياة وكل فئات المجتمع اليمني، حيث مارست الأطراف الصراع وبنسب مختلفة. هذه الانتهاكات انتهاكات جسيمة واسعة نطاق لحقوق الإنسان، وفي حال عدم معالجة هذه الانتهاكات فإن الافتقار إلى المساءلة سيعقد عملية السلام ويجعل من الصعب الانتقال السلس إلى المستقبل، حيث إن هناك حاجة إلى حلول شاملة.
Need for comprehensive solutions that address these violations and combine the rules and principles of normative or theoretical transitional justice as opposed to the Yemeni local reality. Despite Yemen's experience with rounds of armed conflict throughout the past 5 decades since the 60s and the revolutions in the north and south, and over 5 decades. These wars, civil wars, always ended in a decisive victory for one of the parties, and where they would impose their conditions. And so it would be mass clemency for the winner. There would be no accountability for violations of human rights or compensations for victims or redress of damages. The issue of transitional justice was raised first time in 2012-2013's NDC, followed by the Gulf Initiative on the basis of issuing of amnesty or amnesty law or law for former President Ali Abdullah Saleh and his regime, and drafting a law that helps form a committee of investigative committee, redress of damages. However, unfortunately, that immunity law, which is violating of the Constitution and all constitutions in the world, because you cannot issue a law on prior events, and as is the case in anywhere in the world, no one can escape accountability based on a law. This added to a series of failing experiences in the Arab area, and these areas in these countries witnessed some recovery, as we saw in Morocco and as we saw in half-baked transitional justice in Tunisia, but in Yemen it was a complete failure. The history of political struggle in Yemen showed the need for a successful transitional justice based on a criminal accountability and restorative justice. Criminal accountability and restorative justice, which are a national necessity and human necessity. Leaving the door open after all these wars and violations led to new rounds of struggle. Every party, feeling that they have lost in this war, started preparing themselves for the next war when they get the opportunity, as we saw in the southern areas, and as we saw with the Al-Houthi group when the Imama rule in Yemen failed. They always continued to dream about returning to power, and they did through the coup that they orchestrated in September 21st in 2014, when they raided the Yemeni cities and controlled the country and institutions. After about 8 years of the war, destructive war, Yemen now is witnessing the largest humanitarian catastrophe in the modern era. friends and brothers and sisters, when a child dies in Taas by a sniper, a Houthi sniper, all the TV stations and so on talk about and becomes a public opinion issue. But we don't feel that in every 1.25 minute in Yemen, a child loses his life because of malnutrition. Tens of thousands of students die every year because of famine and malnutrition. As previously mentioned, the application of the principle of transitional justice in accordance with recognized international standards and models adopted by some countries will face difficulties, primarily due to the fact that these models have traditionally been implemented following the termination of armed conflict in a traditional way and under a clear victory of one of the warring parties and under institutions that led such reconciliation. Can we implement transitional justice in Yemen? Yes, Yemen has a cultural heritage dominated by tribal customs and religious and moral obligations, represented in forgiveness of bloodshed, reconciliation, forgetting the past, and turning a new page according to generally accepted traditional foundations, mainly by apologizing for the mistake and acknowledging it. Such a heritage, in its essence, intersects with the moral and restorative aspect of transitional justice. This constitutes a reliable ground for developing a model for transitional justice in Yemen. This was demonstrated through the National Dialogue Conference, which represented a unique Yemeni model and almost led to a state of political and democratic stability before the Houthi coup took place. So proposing transitional justice in its full sense requires an international will by the United Nations and the countries sponsoring peace negotiations such as the United States, Britain, and the European Union. Additionally, this includes stopping the interference by external support that the Houthi groups receive from Iran and as well as UAE supported received by the Southern Transitional Council. It doesn't seem that there is a commitment towards establishing a civic state. There is fragile peace, but there is not strong will from everyone to bring about true peace and establish a true civic state, sovereign and fully dominant on its lands. And what we fear is that we'll bring back a fragile peace that makes everyone get ready for another round of struggle. دقيقة واحدة. I just got warm. There are impediments or obstacles towards in the way of transitional justice. External intervention and support for armed groups. Hundreds of thousands of fighters recruited during the war by the Houthis, the transitional government, and the legitimate government that supports they exceed 1 million fighters, and some even say 1,200,000 fighters. This is an impediment when we form peace. Where will they go after fighting for years? They love the rifle and they love this life, and some of them say they put on their shoulders the rank of a major general. Also, the collapse of the judiciary and security apparatus and the parties took control over time. The ideological motives of the Houthis, these ideological motives, and they see that what they are doing is a solemn duty. How can you convince them to get into peace and leave that sacred duty? Also, there are other regional incentives. For a just peace, this is the last minute, a real transitional justice, and to ensure that the country does not slide back into a new war, I think we should do the following. Number one, stop external interference at the political and military level and working to neutralize the influx of weaponry. Number 2, strengthening justice and law enforcement institutions through restructuring and training, as well as mending laws to keep up with the requirements of the current stage. And a constitution that guarantee reconciliation, legal reforms, guarantee freedom, equality, and the peaceful exchange of power, while implementing the outcomes of the national dialogue and adopting the federal system, reforming economic, health, and educational sectors and infrastructures. When the citizen feels improvement on all these services, they will coalesce around the new authority, and many of them can give up certain demands if they feel that there is a new state in place. Political exclusion of those proven to be involved in widespread human rights violations in Yemen cannot be accepted in the future stage because they will go back to their ways. Number 6, developing a long-term completion plan for the work of transitional period, including the election of new leaders according to democratic mechanisms, developing the underlying solutions to the causes of the conflict, and finding a participatory political formula temporarily. 7, involving youth, women, civil society, and forces not involved in the conflict in the transitional process, and implementing the values of reconciliation according to a specific mechanism. Finally, and in conclusion, we would like to emphasize that without serious international support for transitional justice in Yemen, all efforts will be undermined in any peace that does not have good foundation and legal and international support. It is nothing but a temporary peace that will lead ultimately to the return of war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Council. I would like to invite Madame Bushra Nasser for her speech.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for Tawakkol Karman Foundation for this amazing conference, and Liwa for arranging and sponsoring this conference. I might be I'm the last speaker today, and I might have some repetitive paragraphs and statements in my statement that I'm going to talk about today. Though it's going to cover a different perspective, it's the economy's perspective of Yemen and the situation from the economic perspective. It could interlink with the transitional justice, it could interlink with the political solutions. However, economy is the main drive for any conflict. So it's the important subject that drives this conflict that can continue forever. Therefore, there must be some way for stopping it. So as soon as we talk about the Yemeni economy, its challenges, and the perspective for reconstruction, armed conflict and political complexity, armed conflict and political complexity predominate with no improvement in sight. We are now in the 8th year of violent armed conflict, coming to the 9th year, and fragile economy that deteriorated sharply, leaving 80% of the population in need of humanitarian assistance. The existence of dual political and economic institutions with dual exchange rate systems has far-reached implications for crisis factors and features throughout the country. The weaknesses of the legitimate Yemeni government have resulted in its inability to meet basic economic needs and ensure the enforcement of laws for essential social services, which has added to the complexity of the situation. The lack of role of parliament and oversight institutions and the division of authorities in the liberal areas, the lack of financial efficiency and capacity in public finance, and the absence of infrastructure and information suitable for preparation of general state budget, the weak efficiency in the collection of public revenues, the fragmentation of tax bases, and the erosion of hard currency needs of the central bank. The sharp decline in oil and gas exports, the resource resources that no longer effectively flow into the accounts of the central bank, which accounts 75% of the state budget. The dislocated public facilities such as oil and fisheries, the chains around the use of ports and airports, and above all, the deep corruption, the lack of governance, and the failure of the state authorities to practice the principles of good governance with effective jurisdictions aggravate the situation. In addition to all these challenges, there are other multiple effects such as COVID-19 pandemic, climate shocks such as floods, the decline in fishery resources, drought, the rise of food prices. The Ukrainian conflict has exacerbated the food insecurity. The worsening food insecurity, the humanitarian crisis, and the increasing internal displacement of 13% of the population are putting greater pressure on the Yemeni people and the Yemeni economy. Yemen's profound dilemma is state sovereignty in decision-making, as a legitimate government representing the Yemeni people has been eroded by Saudi Arabia and Emirates through that transitional council in the south. On the other hand, the northern part of Yemen is controlled by the Houthis militia, an Iranian allied militia that considers itself Hashemite supremacist. Hashemist or Sayyid, the Lords, a statement never heard in the last since 20th century. An Iranian allied militia that consider itself Hashemite supremacist, Hashemist or Sayyid, the Lords, they make only 2 to 3% of the population. But they believe that they have the doctrine of, they are descendant of Prophet Muhammad, and they have the divine to rule the Yemeni people politically, economically, socially, and intellectually, according to their doctrine. This justifies the war they have waged against the Yemenis and against the state since 2004. Today, they control 80% of the population in a Nazi fascist manner, based on their doctrine, basically. Nevertheless, their holy war against the Yemeni people is not yet over. This is shown by the fact that they don't want to end this conflict, to accept economic solutions that could improve the situation of Yemenis. On the contrary, they have and continue to use aid and even charity as an attractive facade to maintain their war, besiege the people, and exploit their needs. To achieve their political goals, Yemenis have suffered under the Imamites, Hashemites, for decades. Today, the world knows who they are, and that's why it's challenging to build just, peace, and democratic state based on justice and equality is far from achievements. When we have this theological ideology that exists that contradicts basic human and economic rights. Nevertheless, this group has not been identified as a terror group. Yesterday, not far away, 4 years ago, in a Carnegie Institute, I remember Ambassador Barbara, American Ambassador Barbara, she was asked about the Houthis. She said they are a bubble. Today the bubble is controlling a state, and tomorrow the bubble will control the marine strait in the international marine trade. So this is not, please not be naive. There is a problem, and we have to consider this problem. So the opportunities, despite the struggle of the state, the situation in the Yemen economy, can I have 2 minutes? Despite this fragile situation, the Yemeni economy has managed to maintain its resilience due to the adaptivity of the Yemeni people, the decentralized governance structure and the role of the local institutions, the social safety and the role of the culture and norms, the role of women in community resilience and social cohesion, the vibrant civil society, and most important is the private sector contribution and remittances from the diaspora. During this war, the Yemeni people concluded that the international community neglected Yemen. Yemen was not given the same attention as in Syria or Ukraine. But Yemeni people cannot wait. They do not deserve to die in silence. The youth deserve to dream and fairly build their democratic, just future, a just peace that mean to last. Given the unprecedented challenges of the economic development efforts and the specific of the conflict, it is crucial to take a new approach to improve the state's capacity to provide economic and social security, and equally important, strengthening the local governance and empower the local people and communities, give them the right to decide. The international community should use new tools with leveraging technology with an inclusive approach to linking humanitarian assistance and development that emphasize on democracy, participation, and accountability. This is important to create a culture that enables the necessary engagements for development and reconstruction, an approach that paves the way for democracy, equity, and inclusion while strengthening the human capital to preserve and sustain these economic and social gains. Focus on building human capital and youth leadership. Yemenis, especially youth, boys and girls, deserve a genuine political and international will to develop a strategy for decent democratic reconstruction and a strategy for just peace. Yemenis deserve to develop a vision and appropriate resources to implement this vision. Yemen cannot wait for peace to begin the reconstruction and rehabilitation. Controversially, it is important to create a vision and scenario for future in early stages of constructions. Early recovery and reconstruction and rehabilitation are key to promoting the transition to peace. Thank you.
Thank you.